Okay, let's see if we can come up with a workable version, or at least work through some of this here with the consumption smoothing. Let me see if I can get this a little bit better lined up. Okay, so again, we'll just put dollars here on the vertical, and we have years here on the horizontal. So let's assume that you start working maybe at the age of 20. And again, as you know from the previous lectures, there might be a reason to argue that before this time, maybe you're consumption smoothing by borrowing, or maybe even in this time. But let's make our lives really easy and assume that for most people, the bulk of their needs are taken care of by friends, family, loved ones prior to the age of 20. Okay? So now we have some options. Maybe the idea would be people start working at 20, work until they're 70, and then they retire. Now again, going to make some simplifying assumptions. I'm going to just assume that people make, because this makes math work easily, that people make $100,000 or $100 a year. Because again, what we're trying to do with this tool isn't to actually come up with numerical values. It's to figure out what happens in magnitudes here. And maybe that'll make sense in a moment. So maybe we die at 100. And so the question is, obviously this is probably not a great state of affairs. In other words, we would consume 100 in every year while we're working, and then we would retire and we would be begging on the street. Now obviously, incidentally, life earnings are hopefully going to go up across the lifespan, and this is again a simplifying assumption. So the question would be, if we were to perfectly smooth our consumption, so let's ignore some of the time value, money questions, etc., and figure out how would we smooth our consumption. Well, in order to do that, what we would need is to take your total earnings and divide by the total number of years that you are smoothing this across. So in this case, our total number of years would be from the age of 20 to the age of 100, or 80 years. And our total earnings would be how much we make per year times the number of years, in this case, 50. Now I should have had I do have my calculator here handy. So that's 5,000 divided by 80. Let's see what that would be. That gives us a perfectly smooth consumption of 62.5. So in other words, our consumption in every year can be 62.5, which means we would have to save $37.50 during the years in which we work to perfectly smooth this out. So what does this mean? Well, for now, just think about, we have our bridge, and the question is, how big is the pile on the left-hand side of that bridge? If that pile gets larger, holding all else or in other words, if that pile gets larger, holding everything else constant, at all interest rates, people would send more across the bridge. If that pile gets smaller, at all interest rates, people would send less across the bridge. So let's take an example. Maybe now people, instead of retiring at 70, maybe now they choose to retire at 80. So what then would be our perfectly smooth consumption? Well, in this situation, we would now have 6,000 divided by 80, because the number of years we're spreading it across is identical. So let's see, oops, I don't need my camera, I need my calculator. So 6,000, because now we have 60 years in which we're working, divided by 80, yep, means that our consumption, I'll put in a different color here, our consumption goes up to 75. Which means that our pile on the left-hand side goes down in any given year to 25. Now, again, we can add a lot more complicated extensions here. One of the questions would be what percentage of our population is over here, what percentage is in their main prime working years. There's a lot of other complications and ways we could make this more realistic. But it turns out this gives us, so if we think about what this would do then, this argument would then mean that our supply, we have our interest rate and we have the quantity here, stop for a moment and try and figure out what would happen as a result of this to our supply. So we have a smaller pile on the left-hand side of the bridge, which means at this interest rate, would people send more or less across the bridge? I think we would argue they would send less across the bridge, and less. So in effect, our supply schedule would shift to the left. Now that might not seem right. So that's, we can say, oh, if people live longer, people work longer, then that's what would happen. On the other hand, let's maybe take a situation where we say, what happens if we put on a large, maybe we take income taxes from 0% to 10%, in which case, while our actual income hasn't gone down, we'll go back to where we were, by the way. We'll reset, because again, the numbers don't really matter. What matters is the trend, the size. Does this pile get bigger or smaller? So we put an income tax on of 10%. Our take-home income now is not 100, but it's 90. Now, if people don't choose to work longer, and that's one of the tricky things with this, is there's many responses that people could have. One thing they could say is, screw that, we're going to work longer. We're going to retire later. Fair enough. But this gives us a way for telling those stories. So if this was the only thing that happened, now we would have 4,500 divided by 80. Let me pull this up here. Because, again, we have 90 years, $90 times 50, and so now our consumption in a given year goes to $56, 56.25. Now, your reaction, of course, might be, well, obviously, then, the pile got bigger or smaller? The question is, how big is this gap? And this gap here is 33.75. And so, in any given year, our savings, the amount that's being set aside, has gone from $37.50 to $33.75. Again, the actual numbers don't matter. What matters is the trend. And so what has happened? Again, this pile has gotten smaller, which means that at all interest rates, people would send less across the bridge. We can look at a number of things here. We could look at people starting work later or earlier. We could look at people living longer. We could look at people retiring earlier or later. We can look at changes in earnings either due to taxes or better opportunities. There's a whole bunch of ways we can work with this. Now, as I mentioned in the earlier video, I have decided personally it's not worth trying to build an intuition. This is the place that I can harness my intuition. I can say, well, let's see, taxes go up. I could try that. Nope, screw it. I'm just going to go ahead and work through this. It doesn't take very long to figure out what the sensible response would be. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how to work with this. This, again, I said, I think that this is the heavy lifting part of our supply of loanable funds. And I personally have found it very difficult to make sense out of what's happening without actually, again, drawing this up. It's much like supply and demand. Many of you early on wanted to harness your intuition about what was going to happen to price and quantity. And that was fine. But I think most of you discovered that it was helpful to harness your intuition through the avenue of our supply and demand tools. That's the same thing here. I may have an intuition about people's response and about the way the world is going to work or the way the world is going to change. But I like to go ahead and use a tool. I like tools that make my life easier. So hopefully this one makes your life easier. Hopefully you understand how it works. I'll upload this and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about this tomorrow morning.